Was asking me about my mother, who is going to be 93, right. And he was talking about his mother had lived to be 93, and I don't want to embarrass you, but you look as good as I've ever seen you look.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you.
How's the rest of your family?
All fine, all 38 of us.
I was excited to learn that you have a grandson running for an office in Georgia.
Governor of Georgia.
Going to be the governor of Georgia. Does he stand a good chance in Georgia?
An excellent chance. He's even ahead in the polls right now, and it's quite early, yeah. This, in fact, this is... this pollster did work for Newt Gingrich, so he's not a Democrat, so...
How many grandchildren do you have?
We just have 12, but we have 9 great-grandchildren, so we have 21 in all.
No. Say that again?
We have 12 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren.
Oh, my God. and you have your own congressional district, don't you?
That's right. And we have 2 or 3 new ones every year.
Oh, my goodness. We'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen, with former President Jimmy Carter. So good to see you. There's 2 things here that I find fascinating. First of all, the situation with Vladimir Putin. Did you ever meet Vladimir Putin?
No, I didn't.
Vladimir Putin decides he wants Crimea to be under Russian control. This is similar to an experience you had when you were president, when the Russians went into Afghanistan.
The Soviets, in Christmas weekend of 1979. And they invaded Afghanistan, and I withdrew our ambassador. I declared an embargo against them. I joined with the American Olympic Committee to withdraw from the Olympics, and we began to arm the freedom fighters in Afghanistan, and I warned Brezhnev that if he went any further, that we would respond militarily.
And did these actions have an effect?
I think so. He never went any further. And, of course, the freedom fighters slowly but surely gained capability of meeting the Soviet troops successfully, and then eventually under Gorbachev, the Russians realized they were making a horrible mistake, and they withdrew from Afghanistan. So it was successful in stopping them there. And
were you president today, would you invoke the same embargoes, the same rules?
I think that it was inevitable, in my opinion, that Putin was going to invade and take over Crimea.
Inevitable? Why did you feel?
I think no matter what the threats against him were, he would have done it, because the Russians consider Crimea to be part of their country, and Crimeans descent, well, a large majority of them consider themselves to be Russians. But I think that's where he needs to stop. And no matter what President Obama or the Europeans had done, he would have gone ahead and taken over Crimea after they voted in a referendum to join the Soviet Union, whether it was fair or not. So, but I don't think he should be permitted to go any further.
And if the United States decided they wanted Windsor, Ontario, which is just right across the river from Detroit or something like that.
I've heard about it.
And we went up there and we sent our tanks in. I mean, could we get away with that?
I doubt that the people in Windsor would approve.
Yeah. But, I mean, my comparison is ridiculous.
I know.
But is it essentially I mean, he wants it because it's strategically, militarily to Russia. Is that correct?
That's true. And in fact, the Russians, as you know, the Soviets under Khrushchev gave this to the province of Ukraine back in 1954. And so it's always been considered to be part of Russia, basically. And the Russians had a right, as you know, to keep about 20,000 people there, along with their Navy base, for the Black Sea. So it was kind of very deeply associated more with Russia than it was with eastern Ukraine.
Now, is this going to increase internal strife in the Ukraine?
It depends on whether Putin tries to go any further. I think Putin will try to move more vigorously into eastern Ukraine, but he won't do it by military force. He's going to try to seduce the eastern Ukrainians many of whom speak Russian and so forth, to look with Russia on a favorable basis. He's going to woo them with loans and with trade concessions and that sort of thing, so they will think that Russia is a good place to join. Mm-hmm. But I don't think he'll move militarily.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see. 10 years from now, will it have made a great difference? Will any of these sanctions that are being placed on Russia now make a difference immediately?
I don't think so. You know, as a matter of fact, what we've done so far is just name some prominent Russians whose bank accounts are frozen and who can't trade with the Western world. I don't think so.
When you were president, I don't know if I knew it at the time, but it's fascinating to read about this now.
Yes.
That you had installed, and help me out here if I've got this wrong, on a roof of one of the buildings at the White House.
The Oval Office.
The Oval Office.
Yeah.
Solar panels.
That's right.
Solar panels. This was 1979.
That's right. 36 of them.
Yeah. Because then you realized the importance of other forms, alternative energy.
Exactly.
And what became of that?
They stayed there till I left office. Mm-hmm. And then another. And then I think, unfortunately for the United States and for other people, the next president, President Reagan, decided that the panel should not be there. We should not make any foolish moves towards admitting that the United States wasn't all-powerful and that we should save energy, that we didn't have to save it. We could just waste it as long as we wanted to.
Right.
So he withdrew.
So now that's a fascinating point, because symbolically, to Reagan, perhaps, leaving those solar panels in place gave an indication that we were leaning away from petroleum in this country. Well, you wouldn't want to upset the petrol lobbyists.
Some wouldn't. I did, but some would not. Yeah, that's true.
But now... But now it will take a global mandate to do anything about climate change.
Well, we should. You know, I go to China every year. I normalize relations with China, and I met with Xi Jinping 4 times. And so I go there every year. And my thinking is that the global warming is real, and that the only way ultimately to resolve it is for the United States and China to form a bilateral commitment, with the United States, a very wealthy country and so forth, and with China suffering as a developing nation with air and water pollution that's very bad. If our 2 great countries could get together and say, why don't we make these mutual concessions, in my opinion, Europe and the rest of the world would go along with it.
Yes. Now, do these 2 great countries possess this kind of wisdom?
Well, it would have to be involving some things that would be very unpopular in the United States with the Congress, like a carbon tax. A tax on carbon that we put into the air, which would discourage that being done and move toward solar energy and others, and the conservation of energy in all forms. But also it would result in the more efficient automobiles, more efficient house insulation, more efficient refrigerators and stoves and so forth. And I think an effort both to produce alternative matters of energy, sources of energy, and also to conserve what we don't need.
And the countries that would do that, China, the United States, or whomever, yeah, would be heroes, really, wouldn't they?
I think so. And, you know, the Europeans have been trying to do this, but they haven't been able to get the United States to join in with them, I would say, since George H.W. Bush left office. He was a champion of conserving energy, but since then, the United States has withdrawn from our leadership role.
I think it was Ronald Reagan who said, Mr. President, take down those solar panels. I think.
Something like that.
This is the book. We'll be right back with President Jimmy Carter. In the book, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power, tell us about women. Things are contained in this book that I was completely ignorant about and am stunned by what I know of what is covered here. What is the source of this? The abuse of women, essential slavery, human trafficking, on and on.
Well, it's the worst human rights abuse on earth, and it's basically unaddressed. I'll start with the worst statistic that I know, and that is that 160 million girls are now missing from the face of the earth because they were murdered at birth by their parents, or either selectively aborted when the parents find out that the fetus is a girl. So that's many people are missing, and they're all girls who are missing. The second,
and how many countries represented in this?
a good many countries. I don't know how many parents in America would rather have a boy than a girl if they're very poor and they feel they can't support children. But in about 15 years ago, there was an accurate assessment in China, and 50 million were already missing there because the Chinese government had mandated one is best, two is most. And then India has had the same problem with them, and in many other countries as well. So now, for instance, in China and India and South Korea and some other countries, young men can't find brides to marry. So they buy brides, and that increases the amount of slavery that exists on earth. The slave trade now is much greater than it ever was in the 19th century. It amounts to about $32 billion a year. And the United States State Department is required by law now to assess the slavery market. And they estimate that 800,000 slaves are sold across international borders every year. And 80% of those slaves sold are young girls who are being sold into the sex slavery. And this occurs, about 100,000 of them are in the United States, not sold across international borders. Atlanta is a key of a human trafficking or slavery trade.
How and why would it be? Well, how and why does it exist anywhere? How and why would Atlanta be the center of it in the United States?
I think because we have the largest airport on earth, and people come there from all over the southern part of the hemisphere, where girls can be bought cheaper than in other parts. In the southern part of a hemisphere, in Latin America and also, say, in Africa and so forth, in some parts of Asia, you can buy a girl, they can buy a girl for $1,000. In Europe and so forth, it costs up to $8,000. But a pimp or a brothel owner can make about $20,000 a year per girl when she's in slavery. And a lot of these prostitutes are there against their will. They didn't want to be there to start with, but they're threatened, they're drugged, and so forth, and they can't leave. And so this goes on a lot in our country as well as in other countries. So this is just two of the things that I mentioned, the murder of little girls and slavery. But just look, our country is pretty well culpable as well. By the way, every time I mention something in the book, I give a solution for it. One of the worst places in our country for sexual abuse is on college campuses, university campuses. The finest universities in America are a place where girls are regularly abused. Quite often the rapists are serial rapists who know that when they go to a college campus, they won't be revealed and they won't be charged, they won't be prosecuted. Because college presidents and deans don't want their universities to get a reputation as a center for sexual abuse. And as you've read in the newspaper a lot lately, everybody has heard, the same thing applies in the U.S. military. Year before last, there were 26,000 cases of sexual abuse, and only about 300 were actually brought to justice, which is about 1%. In fact, only 4% of women on college campuses report a rape. And that's about 1/6 as much as in civilian life. So you see that these two of the most, I would say, revered institutions in America, if it's that bad in our country, how much worse it would be in other countries where sexual mutilation
I'm just stunned that we're sitting here having this conversation.
Well, it's
2014, we're talking about this.
It's almost incredible. It's hard to believe.
It's unfathomable. Yeah. Some of it, is it all economic? Is some of it cultural?
A lot of it is economic, yes, and some of it is cultural because in some areas of the world, even though the Quran doesn't mandate it, and certainly the Bible doesn't, little girls have their genitals removed when they are born, or before they're 4 years old. For instance, in Egypt, where I go quite often, it's looked on as a fairly moderate country, over 90% of all the females above 4 years old have had their genitals cut or mutilated. And in some other countries, like Sudan and so forth, it gets up to above 95% of girls who have their genitals removed. So they can't enjoy sex. And in the most extreme cases, after the cutter, they call them, with a razor blade, after they remove the adjournment part of a female sexual organs, they sew them up. So there's a tiny orifice there through which the girls can urinate or menstruate, and they cut them open again when they get married.
James Bamford, Pretext for War book I gave you at Borders in Westwood last year, and also, did you get a chance to read it about how the Iraq War was for Israel? And also, the Immersion on Walt paper addresses what that lady just did to you so rudely regarding calling you an anti-Semite, I believe. It's smear process or tactics used to get away from the question of how much power the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, and similar have on the U.S. political system when it comes to talking about the pressure put by Israel and the fifth columnists that support Israel in the U.S. And lastly, you had mentioned that Israel's, not an apartheid state, yet there's a recent article in Aharatz that mentions that they're not allowing marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and the Israeli newspaper Aharatz. And how many Palestinians are on the Israeli cabinet, President Carter? I respect your writing a great deal, but to ignore that Israel is practicing apartheid isn't exactly accurate. And lastly, why don't we, one more point, why aren't we hearing Paul Finley, the former Republican congressman who wrote the book, They Dare to Speak Out, about the pressure of the pro-Israel lobby? He's written several books, and I've never seen him on C-SPAN's Book TV once.
Thank you, caller. You have seen him. I mean, you haven't seen him, but he's been there. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know how to answer those questions. You know, when somebody gives me a book about an interesting subject, habitually I get the book from my staff who are madly handing me books to sign in the bookstore, and particularly one that was about Israel and its relationships. While I was writing my book, I avidly studied all the books that I had available to me, so I would guess that I did that. Well, you know, I think that AIPAC, which is a lobbying group that's devoted to Israeli Americans. It's not American Jews. It's those who are supporting Israel, and some of the American Jews don't comply with that. So it's an Israeli lobby, and they have a perfect right to represent the policies of Israel in the United States, and I don't question that at all. But I think that the thing that is preventing now Israel having a chance for the peace that we all pray for, permanent peace, in their own borders, recognized by every Arab country and the entire world, living side by side in harmony with the Palestinians, that's what this book is designed to accomplish. And I don't think it's going to ever do that as long as there's no debate, no discussion, and people are intimidated from expressing their views frankly, or from even studying that. I've been invited by professors, for instance, to speak in some of the most famous universities that deal with primarily Jewish students. I have not been permitted to go on those campuses to hold a lecture. And so the pressures are intense. But I think that the people of Israel want peace. The Palestinians want peace. The Jordanians want peace. The Lebanese want peace. Everybody, all the Palestinians also share that hope for peace. And I hope that this book will break the ice, and at least people start looking at the facts inside Palestine, finding a way for Israelis to have peace.
Can you give us an example of a recent time in which you were not allowed to make a speech because of your ideas and stands?
Well, I'm really reluctant to mention specific places, but I have been given invitations to speak on college campuses by individual professors who might be more militant on the subject, or more open-minded on the subject, is maybe a better word. But then when I inquired to the leaders of a university, I've been told that the issue is too controversial, or that maybe we should wait till next year, or something of that kind.
Good evening. Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem that's unprecedented in our history. With the exception of preventing war, this is the greatest challenge that our country will face during our lifetime. The energy crisis has not yet overwhelmed us, but it will if we do not act quickly. It's a problem that we will not be able to solve in the next few years, and it's likely to get progressively worse through the rest of this century. We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources. By acting now, we can control our future instead of letting the future control us. 2 days from now, I will present to Congress my energy proposals. Its members will be my partners, and they have already given me a great deal of valuable advice. Many of these proposals will be unpopular. Some will cause you to put up with inconveniences and to make sacrifices. The most important thing about these proposals is that the alternative may be a national catastrophe. Further delay can affect our strength and our power as a nation. Our decision about energy will test the character of the American people and the ability of the President and the Congress to govern this nation. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war, except that we will be uniting our efforts to build and not to destroy. Now, I know that some of you may doubt that we face real energy shortages. The 1973 gas lines are gone, and with this springtime weather, our homes are warm again. But our energy problem is worse tonight than it was in 1973 or a few weeks ago in the dead of winter. It's worse because more waste has occurred and more time has passed by without our planning for the future. And it'll get worse every day until we act. The oil and natural gas that we rely on for 75% of our energy are simply running out. In spite of increased effort, domestic production has been dropping steadily at about 6% a year. Imports have doubled in the last 5 years, and our nation's economic and political independence is becoming increasingly vulnerable. Unless profound changes are made to lower oil consumption, we now believe that early in the 1980s, the world will be demanding more oil than it can produce. The world now uses about 60 million barrels of oil a day, and demand increases each year about 5%. This means that just to stay even, we need the production of a new Texas every year, an Alaskan North Slope every 9 months, or a new Saudi Arabia every 3 years. Obviously, this cannot continue. We must look back into history to understand our energy problem. Twice in the last several hundred years, there's been a transition in the way people use energy. The first was about 200 years ago, when we changed away from wood, which had provided about 90% of all fuel, to coal, which was much more efficient. This change became the basis of the Industrial Revolution. The second change took place in this century, with the growing use of oil and natural gas. They were more convenient and cheaper than coal, and the supply seemed to be almost without limit. They made possible the age of automobile and airplane travel. Nearly everyone who is alive today grew up during this period, and we have never known anything different. Because we are now running out of gas and oil, we must prepare quickly for a third change, to strict conservation, and to the renewed use of coal, and to permanent renewable energy sources like solar power.
Well, it's a great honor for me to be here today, and it reminds me of my favorite cartoon in a New Yorker magazine. This little boy is looking up at his father, and he says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." Well, 4 of us have already made that goal, and one is still working on it, but it is a wonderful thing to be with the other presidents and to have a chance to address this wonderful audience. I'll be very brief, and I'll be limiting my comments just to the things that I know personally that have been important for me and for George W. Bush. In 2000, as some of you may remember, there was a disputed election for several weeks. And finally, when President Bush became president, they had the inauguration in Washington on schedule. And I think my wife and I were the only 2 volunteer Democrats on the platform. And George and Laura afterwards came up and thanked us for coming. And so he said, "Now, if there's anything I can ever do for you, let me know," which was a mistake he made. And I said, "Mr. President, the Carter Center has programs in 35 countries in the world, and the worst problem now is a war going on between North and South Sudan. And millions of people have been killed, and I'd like for you to help us have a peace agreement there." And in a weak moment, he said, "I'll do it." And I said, "When can I meet your Secretary of State and your National Security Advisor?" He said, "Well, I haven't even chosen them yet, but give us 3 weeks." So 3 weeks later, I came up and met with Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, and President Bush kept his promise. He appointed a distinguished senator from Missouri, John Danforth, and a great general from Kenya named Sumbewo. And in January of 2005, there was a peace treaty between North and South Sudan that ended a war that had been going for 21 years. George W. Bush is responsible for that. And that was the first of his great contributions to the countries in Africa. As has already been mentioned briefly here, he increased the development assistance to Africa from the time he went in office until he left from $1.4 billion to more than $9 billion. And that's an increase of 640%. That is development assistance. He established a PEPFAR program. There were 50,000 HIV sufferers in Africa being treated when he came in office. When he left office per year, 2 million. I'll let you figure the percentage on that. And now at this new institute, he has a program called Pink Ribbon, Red Ribbon, and he's to save women from cervical and breast cancer in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's, again, is something that's dear to my heart and I know means a lot to millions of people in Africa. So, Mr. President, let me say that I'm filled with admiration for you and deep gratitude for you about the great contributions you've made to the most needy people on earth. Thank you very much.
A scene from the Oscar-nominated film Argo about a daring rescue during the Iranian hostage crisis. I'm back now, former President Jimmy Carter, who was, of course, in the White House at the time. You've seen Argo, I take it?
Yeah, I have.
How accurate is it from your memory?
Well, let me say, first of all, it's a great drama, and I hope it gets the Academy Award for Best Film, because I think it deserves it. The only thing I would say was that 90% of the contributions to the ideas and the consummation of the plan was Canadian. And the movie gives almost full credit to the American CIA. And with that exception, the movie is very good. But Ben Affleck's character in the film was only in Tehran a day and a half. And the main hero, in my opinion, was Ken Taylor, who was a Canadian ambassador who orchestrated the entire process.